I'm David Gibson. I'm the director of the Center on Religion and Culture here at Fordham and your host for this evening for this event, China's New Civil Religion, a challenge and opportunity for the West for engagement, as we say. A talk by our China expert Ian Johnson and a response from Kyoreto Yan, who's in Shanghai, and questions from you all, the audience. So we welcome all of you here to Fordham this evening in person, and to the many joining us from around the world via Zoom, finally. We're very pleased to hold this presentation on this tremendously important and urgent topic, religion in China. And I want to stress that this event is made possible by the work and support of our co-organizers and our co-sponsors, the U.S.-China Catholic Association, the China Academic Consortium, and China Source. And before we start our official presentation, I just want to invite the Vice President for Partnerships and China Engagement at China Source, Joanne Pittman, to step up briefly and tell you a little bit about these organizations. Joanne?
Thank you, David, and everybody for the chance to be here tonight. This lecture is part of a joint lecture series sponsored by the U.S.-China Catholic Association, China Academic Consortium, and China Source. And our aim is to explore Christianity and culture in China, both from the current situation as well as a historical perspective. The China Academic Consortium, the mission of that organization is to nurture, equip, and grow mainland Chinese scholars and to enhance understanding between China and the West. They have a worldview seminar this summer, as well as an online book club, and you can visit their website if you want to find out more information. China Source, the organization that I represent, our mission is to educate the global church on issues facing Christians in China and to connect Christians inside and outside China. We do this through online publications and webinars and events. You can find us at chinasource.org. The U.S.-China Catholic Association was founded in the 80s, and their mission is to maintain fraternal ties between Chinese brothers and sisters and those outside of China. And they wanted to highlight, they have a study tour hopefully coming up this summer to China, as well as an international conference that was going to be held in the Chicago area. So those are the organizations that pull this together, and we thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Joanne, and I really can't thank you enough for these organizations that have helped bring this about and connect us directly with China. And also a shout out to Father Michael Agliardo, a Jesuit who's head of the U.S. Catholic China Association, who was instrumental in bringing this off and had an illness and could not make it. He'll be well, but he regrets that he could not be here in person tonight. Before we go to Ian, our featured speaker, a couple quick ground rules. First, please silence your cell phones. And second, after Ian gives his talk, I'll introduce our respondent in China, Kyoreto Yan, waiting on Zoom. And following Kiyoreto's remarks, I'll moderate the discussion between them and with you all gathered here. So please be ready with some questions, whatever is prompted by our presentations tonight. And remember, we will have a wine and cheese reception after this, and believe me, we'll all meet. Now, Ian Johnson is the Stephen A. Schwartzman Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who lived in China for more than 20 years. As you can see, he's a regular contributor to the New York Times and author of several excellent books on China. And in fact, Ian recently had a piece in the New Yorker magazine on Jessica Chen Weiss, titled "A Professor Who Challenges the Washington Consensus on China." And Ian himself can be very challenging, and we're looking forward to his views tonight. Ian, deliver.
So, thanks very much for coming out on this rainy evening, and also to the people on Zoom. I'm here to talk about an aspect of China that doesn't get maybe a lot of attention, and that's the faith and value systems in the country, but especially what I'm going to talk about is maybe even a little bit more unusual. That's what the governments, you might think of it as the use of religion or the attempts to use religion. So I'm going to, I use the term civil religion. We'll get into that a little bit later. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about the background to what has been over the past 40 years, a kind of religious revival in China. And what the government's reaction has been to that revival, that return of faith and values to China. For people on Zoom, I'll have a few slides that are blank. Don't worry about that. That's just where I want to take the focus off the image for a little while. But the images will continue, and then so don't be worried about that. For the audience, for the live audience, it doesn't really matter so much. So talk about the return of religion. I'm not sure how many people in the audience are familiar with the situation of religion in China, but basically after the People's Republic was founded in 1949, there was an effort to organize religion in China into 5 faith groups: Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, and then for administrative purposes in China, Christianity was divided into 2 separate groups: Catholicism and Protestantism. And so those are the 5 accepted religions in China. That by the late 1950s, these 5 groups had been largely overwhelmed by what the party euphemistically called leftist excesses, which meant extreme version of Maoist thought, which erased most of the religious work, at least the legal, official, above-ground religious life in China. Most churches and temples and mosques were closed, and things only really recovered later. So these are, sort of famous images of the destruction of the religious infrastructure in China in the 60s and 70s. And we don't need to go into all of that, but it's just important to realize that starting in the late 1970s, in what we now call the Reform era, religious life returned, official religious life, legal religious life returned, but again, only in these 5 acceptable faith groups: Taoism, China's indigenous religion, Buddhism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism. The government's view in the Reform era was that this should be of importance: economic growth. And this would be sort of the benchmark for how people should focus their lives. This was actually a picture that I took in 1984 at the 35th anniversary of the PRC in Beijing. This is a giant float showing the ever-increasing industrial production, up, 100% 1949. And by 1983, it was already at 5,730% and just going to head further upwards. And this should be the way people kind of organized and thought of their lives. It should focus primarily on economics. However, the 5 official religions were allowed back. They were reconstituted. Seminaries, training schools were reopened, but the party primarily saw it as maybe a sop to society, as something maybe that older people would be interested in, and then eventually these older people would die out and China would march towards socialism and then communism, where religion played very little role in daily life. You can see this as an analogy, analogous to, in the West, the belief in the modernization theory. That is, countries or societies got richer and more developed, that religion would play less and less of a role and eventually sort of evaporate. This was taken to an extreme degree, maybe in China. The overall feeling in the 1980s was, instead of trying to force religion's destruction, they would just allow things to play out a little bit. And in general, the government ruled China with a lighter hand after that. These are a few images of what actually happened. There was a revival of religion. It wasn't just old people who went to temples and churches and mosques. It was people from all walks of life and different age groups, religion kind of took off in terms of the number of certainly the number of temples and the number of young people who would attend these as well. So it was no longer, it wasn't as the party imagined. It was something that was much more vibrant and more widespread. And I think this was a reflection of this economically focused vision of society that the party was offering. That this was not enough for most people. It's not enough, maybe for humans in general, right? To just have economics be the basis of your life. So these are some pictures taken in the 2010s of various religious sites around China, churches and temples. The state reacted to this in different ways. And I should say, maybe as an aside, I focus most of my attention on ethnic Chinese, so Han Chinese. This is the focus of my study because for language reasons and for when I was living in China, I have been to Muslim parts of China, but it is not the center point of my research. So while I can talk about it, and I'll bring it up later, it's part of the overall story I want to talk about tonight. It's not the absolute focus of my research. So the state had various visions of how religion could be harnessed. The picture in the center is the former head of the State Administration for Religious Affairs, Ye Xiaowen, who sort of had this idea that religion could be useful in society, that it could be maybe a supplement to the values in society. He eventually, this isn't to say that China had a extremely tolerant view of religion through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but that maybe, relatively speaking, especially if we compare to how things developed over the past decade, there was a more openness to this. There was a willingness to work with local religious leaders if they were working with the local Communist Party, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this person, Ye Xiaowen, in the middle, exemplified that, and that's actually kind of a neat picture of him sitting with other people on stage. But I think that what began to happen by the late 2000s, after the 2008 Olympics, roughly, if you want to sort of date it, these things are never that firm or fixed, but the government began to realize that religious organizations, religious groups were part of a problem, which was the rise of civil society and other groups that were harder to control, including social media. And hence I have some picture of Weibo, which is a kind of Twitter-like social media app in China. And that these organizations, not just religious groups, but even environmental groups or women's rights groups, environmental organizations, that they were too independent of government control, and that the government had to find a way to react to this and to bring society, that maybe things had gone too far, that it was necessary in the 1980s to relax control over society. And that worked okay in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, but by the late 2000s, that things had gone a little bit too far. So they posited the idea of wanting to indigenize Chinese religion. This was something that came up this was first brought up in the early 2010s, about a decade ago. When we think of indigenizing religion, we might think of images like this, which was paintings by Catholics in the 1920s as a way of indigenizing Catholicism in China, or we might think of architectural forms of indigenizing Chinese so-called foreign religions in China, such as this church pilgrimage site in Shanxi province, or different forms of, say, marriage. This is a marriage ceremony which has some traditional elements, the couple in the front about to kowtow in front of their parents and in-laws, but in the middle is a picture of Jesus. This is from a traditional Catholic wedding that I attended in Shanxi. And those are all ways one can think of indigenization of religion, but it wasn't really what the party had in mind. It wasn't so much trying to make the theology or the form of religion fit into Chinese culture a little bit better, but was rather a form of further control over religion, or reasserting control over religion. And in some ways, this image, which has become quite common in China, that religious sites have to show the flag, the national flag. They have to, this mosque in Dunhuang in Western China, maybe the flag isn't quite so clear, but these are all sort of new developments that churches, mosques, and temples have to show the flag. Even Buddhist and Taoist sites, here, for example, this is a nunnery. This is taken from a newsletter of a nunnery that they are listening to Xi Jinping give an important presentation in 2021. And they're, his speech is being sort of zoomed into the temple where the abbess and her nuns are listening in intently. And of course, they're partially doing this as a show, right? Show where we're listening carefully to the party, we're listening to Xi's speech, etc. But it is a symbol of maybe what the party would like to see among religious groups. I think we can divide the state's reaction to religious groups into two kinds. One are the so-called foreign faiths. And I put them in quotation marks because the foreign faiths that the state has in mind are Islam and Christianity. And yet Islam has been in China for over 1,000 years. There are many ancient mosques on the coastline of China where it first entered along the Silk Road. And of course, Christianity has had a permanent unbroken presence in China for over 400 years. So compared to the history of religion in this country, that's pretty close, actually. So if Christianity is a foreign faith in China, maybe it's a foreign faith in the United States as well, if you can remember like that. But this is how, I think the main idea here is that Islam and Christianity have foreign ties that are perhaps overall stronger than one finds in Buddhism and Taoism. Although Buddhism obviously was founded in India, it's a world religion, and there are many other Buddhist nations besides China. But overall, the party has decided, and Xi Jinping himself has said, that Buddhism has indigenized over the past 2,000 years, and it's now an indigenous Chinese religion. Whereas I think Islam and Christianity are still seen as problematic religions. Muslims are part of the global ummah, the community of faith around the world. Pious Muslims are supposed to go on the Hajj, which means traveling to another country. And over the past 20, 30 years, some Muslims have gone to nearby countries like Malaysia to study in madrasas and so on. And so the party sees that as problematic. And then for Christianity, of course, there's the global community of Christians, which often supports Chinese Christians, and this is also seen as potentially a problem, especially when one thinks of the state's interest as primarily being to be able to assert some kind of control over local social groups. So this is where this is why the state is divided these two groups. And so I'm first going to talk a little bit about foreign faiths. This is something that people may be familiar with already from news reports over the past decade. Islam, I probably don't need to go into too much detail about the crackdown on Islam or overt signs of practicing one's faith in Muslim communities. There are roughly 30 million Muslims in China out of the overall population of 1.4 billion. That's not a huge number, but they are overwhelmingly in border regions, including the one that most people have probably heard, Xinjiang, which is the western region in China. This has led the party to ban things such as, well, it's made it very difficult to go on the Hajj. It considers women wearing the headscarf to be a sign of extremist Muslim behavior, or men who have beards. Halal restaurants that do not serve pork and alcohol are considered to be too extremist. And people who are, even in their homes, if they have the, often you see in Muslim homes, people will have a rug on the wall with the Kabbalah in Mecca. This is seen as too Muslim. And so there's been an effort at, I would call it, forced cultural assimilation. Other people use the more emotively laden term of cultural genocide. But in any case, an effort to push down the presence of Islam in people's lives, including the destruction of shrines in the desert in Xinjiang and the setup of these re-education camps where people are forced to, the government would call them extremist deprogramming centers, but according to reliable reports, hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million people out of a population of 8 million Uyghurs have gone through these camps. So they seem to me like there can't be that many extremists. It's clearly an effort to eradicate any sort of cultural identity based on religion. So and then in terms of Christianity, we have to kind of divide the story again into two. There's Protestantism. One of the trends that was quite noticeable over the past 20 years is that there was always, from the beginning in China, two churches. This goes for Protestantism as well as Catholicism. There's the above-ground legal church, and then there's the underground sort of illegal church. But when religion returned in the 1980s, the government issued a benchmark document called Document 19, and it explicitly said that underground churches were okay. They thought of them primarily maybe as house churches, as just churches that would meet in somebody's living room, but they could understand why people might not want to go to state-run churches. And so they said, okay, well, that's okay, you can do that. And this then began to develop over time into a very sophisticated and much larger religious group than the government probably envisioned in the 1980s. So the number of Christians, maybe this always gets to the statistical numbers and statistical debates. I'm more conservative on the number of Christians in China. I would say there are roughly 60 to 70 million Christians. It's sort of a guesstimate based on numbers. There's no real there is no reliable survey data that's public, at least to we know of. But the government gives lower numbers, but if we assume, especially in Protestantism, maybe a 2-to-1 ratio of underground to above ground Christians, you can easily get to 50, 60 million Protestants, and then maybe another 10 to 12 million Catholics. Again, so in the case of Catholicism, maybe split 50-50 underground, above ground. So these churches began to become much bigger than just house churches, as you might imagine, in somebody's living room with some small infrastructure. They became almost mega churches like this picture here that you see on the screen. And the government, they had their own kindergartens, sometimes even their own seminaries, bookstores. They had their own structures for governing, depending on the particular denomination. And these churches, I think the government began to close them down. These are largely urban-based big churches. And the government closed them down by saying that they, often on technicalities, building construction technicalities, or saying that the lease wasn't valid or something like that. But these big churches were then, in this case, and in some other cases around China, were demolished. And there was a particular church that I followed that I wrote about in my book, The Souls of China. and that was in Chengdu. It was a big urban church called Early Rain, and it has been the overall superstructure, the organizational structure of the church has been destroyed, and now there are just small sort of, again, the house church living room type structures that exist. This is not across the board, but it's overwhelmingly the way that the government has treated Protestantism by trying to return it to this earlier house church form and to get rid of the big structures, because again, the structures are civil society. These are self-organizing, self-financing organizations. They meet the classic definition of civil society, independent organizations not under government control. And that is the main problem that the government has with all of these groups. Not just religious groups, but other groups, be they environmental, feminist organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And in one case, they just said the presence of these churches is simply too big in the cityscape of the area. This was in Zhejiang province. They went around and removed the crosses off the tops of buildings, so about several hundred churches. They just simply, okay, we're not going to have these crosses on the top of all these buildings. We're just going to knock them off. The churches can stay, but we just don't want to make Christianity so present in our communities. So it's again the government's lack of comfort in dealing with these groups. In the case of Catholicism, the government took a different strategy. I would say more, let's call it the diplomatic strategy, and this was to try to strike a deal with the Vatican over how bishops are consecrated. This is a place in Fujian province that I visited and did some reporting on, and that. So the main issue, again, I'm not sure the level of familiarity that people have in the audience, but the issue with Catholicism was mainly how bishops are consecrated and thus how priests were appointed. For people in the underground church, Chinese government appointed bishops who were not legitimate, and therefore the churches under them were also not legitimate, and this forced people to worship in the underground church. Some bishops were approved by the Vatican, others weren't. So the Vatican and Beijing came up with an agreement where they would jointly appoint bishops. To mixed results, that's not really the focus. We can go into that. That would be sort of a long, complicated discussion about whether this is selling out the underground church or a realistic compromise that was necessary. In any case, this was this has been the approach the government has taken toward Catholicism. In this one particular area that I visited called Mindong in the middle of Fujian province, there was an underground bishop who was forced to resign in favor of the government. This was his cathedral that was built with local donations, without government approval. But then you can see the government is offering also carrots. It's not just that you shouldn't worship with the underground church. You should worship in the government church, because the government church is way bigger. It's up on a promontory overlooking the ocean. It's this dramatic church. I took a picture of this when it was under construction a few years ago. Since then, it's been completed. And so we can give you better hardware and infrastructure and stuff like that if you play ball. But this is one part of the government's response. I think this is, when I think of civil religion, I think of government using religious images and ideas to legitimize its rule. And this is really what the government is doing with the other two religious groups in China, Buddhism and Taoism. And these are the local faiths, as the government would say, or the indigenous faiths in China. Soon after taking power in 2012, it's been over 10 years now, Xi Jinping visited History Museum, declared the China Dream, and began in a kind of remarkable way to embrace, or at least give the seal of approval to certain faith groups. The government has always had its own value system, its own ideology, which is communism, and it's had heroes, which are basically the equivalent of saints in the communist pantheon, like this person, Lei Feng, who is supposed to be a selfless, restless screw in the machine who would work for the common good. He died doing a good deed, and the Communist Party played up these people. They still exist. This is a bulletin board in Beijing. You can still see the red and white image of Lei Feng on the top left. He's wearing a sort of big army hat that looks like it has wings on the side. They haven't given up on the communist iconography and ideals and ideology, but they are trying to, I believe, buttress legitimacy by adopting certain religious ideas or religious philosophical ideas that have been at the core of Chinese faith over the past few centuries or millennia. Here he is in 2013, again, just shortly after taking power, took power at the end of 2012, already in 2013, he's visiting Confucius's hometown, and he said some nice things about the works of Confucius. The guy on the left, on the right, is the party secretary of Chufu, Confucius's hometown. It looks like he's having a heart attack. And indeed, a year later, he was removed from his post for corruption, which was Xi's favorite way of sort of getting rid of people that he didn't like. And she also explicitly endorsed a Neo-Confucian philosopher, Wang Yangming. Wang Yangming was a Ming, roughly 500 years ago, a Ming Dynasty era philosopher, who interestingly, one of his most famous ideas is, the thing that Xi Jinping often talks about the most is ideas and action. So you should do what you think, you should do what you believe, but also the idea of an independent conscience. This is something Wang Yangming promulgated. And this is something that Xi has sort of said, he's my favorite philosopher, I read his stuff. And this picture I took at a Wang Yangming theme park in southern China, which was made at the site where he meditated in the cave and attained enlightenment and came up with many of his ideas. He was banned by the court. It's an interesting, complex figure. There's more than, when you look into some of these people who are endorsed by the party, they might almost be anti-authoritarian figures. He was banned by the court, exiled to the south of China for standing up for his ideas. And while down there, meditated and so on and so forth, and came up with this philosophical idea, was later rehabilitated by the emperor and served the empire. He has also explicitly met with Buddhist leaders, shaken hands with the leading abbot, this one from Taiwan. He was given permission to build not just temples in China, but also libraries and seminaries, education centers to train Chinese lay people in Buddhist ideas. So this is something that's quite remarkable. Previous Chinese leaders have not done this. You also see there's a huge building boom. If you go to Buddhist or Taoist temples, this is a Taoist temple complex near Nanjing on Maoshan, and you can see this is all new. Subsequently, this has been completed, and the justification for the rebuilding is that back roughly 1,000 years ago, Maoshan had something like they measure temples by the number of rooms they have in the halls, and now it has something like 500 rooms, but 1,000 years ago it had 5,000 rooms, and so they're sort of saying, well, we can easily increase this temple massively based on historical precedent. So, in China, Chinese history is so long, there have been temples built almost everywhere if you dig, so you can sort of always find a justification to rebuild a temple or to expand a temple. But you see this across the country. The other thing, which I think is really interesting, and maybe the most, in a way, if you were a hardcore atheist leader, which you would find maybe the most controversial, would be embracing groups that were once declared to be superstitious. So when the government declared that there were 5 kinds of religion and 5 kinds of religion only in China, they excluded a vast swath of Chinese religious practice, which is often known as folk religion or popular religion. This is the worship of holy mountains, historical personages. You can think of the god of wealth or many Chinese New Year practices, and including pilgrimages to certain mountains. So outside of Beijing, there's a very large mountain called Miao, not a large mountain per se, it's an important pilgrimage for about several hundred years called Miaofengshan. The groups that would perform were in the Mao era mostly banned, and then they made a comeback in the Reform era as cultural practice. So you see this person here, looks like they're doing some kind of martial arts with stick fighting. You can understand this just as a kind of martial arts, just as you can kind of understand Bach as a purely secular musician. If you wanted to just think of Bach only in terms of the concert hall, you could understand Bach as a secular musician, but you could also understand Bach as a writer of sacred music, of course the cantatas and so on and so forth, the masses. By the same token, you can see these people as simply martial artists, but their main goal is to perform for a deity at a temple fair. And not only does the government now allow this, but it explicitly supports them using a UNESCO term called intangible cultural heritage. So intangible cultural heritage is stuff not like the Great Wall, not like the Forbidden City, but things like it could be something like cuisine, or it could be dance, it could be drama. But as in many traditional societies, in China, these things had a spiritual component. And groups like this now get government money to keep their group together. They get rooms in the local housing area where they're based in Beijing. And when they make their pilgrimage up, they get sort of spending money to pay for the gas for the bus to take them all up and perform. The actual mountain itself has been declared an intangible cultural heritage site. Not the actual mountain, but the pilgrimage itself. And so the pilgrimage gets government support. So in the form of sending firefighters to make sure that nothing happens when people are burning tons and tons of incense, having the police do crowd control, etc., all sort of gratis. But you can't imagine this happening at a Catholic pilgrimage or at a Protestant church where they're given this kind of support, right? But at these places they are. I know people who go to these pilgrimages, they're civil servants, they're given the day off to go, oh, my group is going up on Friday. Oh, no problem. Go ahead and take the day off and go to the pilgrimage. No problem. Won't count against you or anything like that. So this is considered to be a good thing. For local leaders, supporting this kind of cultural practice is seen as one of the things they ought to be doing. Government leaders used to be judged just by economic growth. Are they revving up the economy fast enough and making people rich? And is local society stable? Those were the two benchmarks for whether a party leader was doing his or her job. Now it's also, are you supporting traditional culture? Do you have intangible cultural heritage projects? So it's like this race to find intangible cultural heritage and to support it. So this, again, it isn't always religious based. Again, it could be some chef in Sichuan who makes Sichuanese cuisine. They get intangible cultural heritage that has zero religious component. But in many cases, I would say half the cases, probably it does when you look at these. And these are big events, right? This was when I mentioned they need to have firefighters on hand to make sure nothing gets out of control. This is why, because when the incense is burned, a lot of incense gets burned on the first night and certain nights of the 15-day temple fair. You could say, so this raises the question of, is this a kind of civil religion that the government is promulgating? It's an open question. I think it is. I'm interested in people's feedback, questions, and critiques. Civil religion became big in this country through the work of Robert Bellah, a sociologist who wrote a book on civil religion in America. And he was working, he didn't coin the term, it has an older history, but he said that certain things in American society that we think of as maybe just, that are kinds of secular forms of religion. Worshiping the Statue of Liberty and stuff like that, and the way July 4th is celebrated and parades and that kind of thing has a religious component to it. In China, and yes, and this is how Bella kind of imagined it, this deification, right, of certain things in American political life, essentially. George Washington and all the sort of myths around him. You can also see it in China, even before Xi Jinping. Mao's tomb being constructed right in the heart of Beijing, right in the center of Tiananmen Square. In front of him, this obelisk, the monument to the people's martyrs, right? The Communist Party has martyrs, and it has a cemetery on the outskirts of Beijing that has all of these martyrs. And it's not just a couple of martyrs. Martyrs go down all the way from national level martyrs to provincial level martyrs to county level martyrs, village level martyrs, who all died for the revolution. And many of them have monuments in their hometown or village, or at least some sort of collective monument where people go and lay wreaths. I mean, it's also really interesting if you even look at the religious symbolism in very communist-style buildings, such as the Great Hall of the People, which flanks the Mao mausoleum in downtown Beijing. There is the... Oh yes, let me just say, this was built in the 1950s and it was opened in 1959 for the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic of China being founded. The columns are resting on lotus petals, which comes from Buddhism. There are 12 columns which match the 12 columns in the Hall of Supreme Harmony in the Forbidden City. The floor space was purposefully expanded during construction so that the floor space would exceed the floor space in the Forbidden City. It has 34 rooms, one for each of the provinces and regions of China, which is also a parallel to other structures that dynasties had in traditional China. And it is sort of united under this, when you go inside the Great Hall of the People, under this great red star, the heavens above it, and the seating was also expanded to 10,000. 10,000 in Chinese, wan, is a very important number. It sort of means limitless, and that was also all purposefully built in. So this is even predating the most recent efforts. You can see this quasi playing off religious things. But even now, when you go around Chinese cities, you can't help but see these kinds of things pushing things like, in this case, a poster for cultural self-confidence, which is not necessarily religious, but next to it, another poster pushing Beijing traditional culture. This is at an exercise spot in Beijing, just a small little corner park, which has that guy I mentioned before, that Neo-Confucian philosopher in his theme park in the south, Wang Yangming. This is his key idea, his talk or whatever, words and action, right? Yan, Yu, Xin. So you can see these ideas being pushed by the government as a way to, I think, legitimize this rule. Say it is the upholder of traditional values and religiously imbued religious values, cultural values. So this is all very interesting. I think it has certain implications. We talked about opportunities. The opportunities could be that we can also see some commonalities in some of these ideas of ways to engage with China. But there are also risks, I think. And the risks is that China is a multi-cultural, multi-ethnic nation. When the People's Republic largely inherited the borders of the old Qing dynasty, which included many people of different faiths and so on. This is a map showing the Buddhist sites in China. You can see all the red sites are Tibetan Buddhist sites. When I was talking about using Buddhism that did not include Tibetan Buddhism. That was primarily Han Chinese, ethnic Chinese Buddhism, not Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, the western region of China, this is where Islam is primarily located. These groups are also sort of excluded from this effort at synthesizing religion in the state. So it's a kind of exclusionary vision of how the state can harness religious and philosophical ideas, one that I think has inherent tensions for the People's Republic of China. We've seen this, there have been protests overseas against China's treatment of Muslims, and we see a huge online community of people who are not happy with the treatment of Christians. I mean, overall, I think though the melding of religion and the state is something we're going to see more and more of in China. And this puts religion sort of back in the center of Chinese society and Chinese politics. And I think it should be something that when we're thinking about China and how to engage with China, it should be something much more present. It's not just something for certain interest groups in China or interest groups in this country, but it's fundamental to how the state sees itself as the defender of so-called traditional Chinese culture and faiths. You could make a parallel, perhaps, to Vladimir Putin's Russia, where Putin has cast aside his atheistic past as a KGB agent and is now sort of a defender of the faith, going to church. Now, Xi Jinping does not go to temples and worship and kowtow and light incense, but you can see that his government has certainly felt comfortable in using these ideas. So I think with that, I'll leave it with this picture, which is something I took at a temple outside of, in Hubei province. This shows the core socialist values and a Taoist deity that had just been delivered at the temple from a stone mason's place. But I think it does neatly encapsulate the melding of religion and values. So with that, I'll stop my presentation.
Let me just quickly introduce Chiaretto, who you can see up there. And you can see his biography there, so I don't need to go into it. Dr. Qin Shun Chiaretto Yan lives in Shanghai. He's a visiting professor at St. Joseph's University in Macau and at the National Seminary of the Catholic Church in China. Chiaretto, thank you for joining us from Shanghai. Take it away.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Although I'm in the morning here, so I'm a Catholic. My primary area of research is religions and cultures of Asia and interfaith dialogue. My observations and responses are more from a Catholic perspective as well as a Chinese perspective. So on the screen, you see that as a response to Ian's presentation, I try to answer these three questions and come up with to see engagement as an opportunity, as to the title of this conference. Engagement as opportunity, and even see it as a possible game changer for international relations. So these three questions and one possible game changer. To Ian's question, is the party still allowing some religions, especially Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religions, to grow, but at the same time eyeing the Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Islam, more skeptically? My way of looking at it is more from a Chinese perspective. Among the 5 official religions recognized in China, actually 4 of them came from outside historically. Buddhism came from India. Islam is linked with ethnic minorities at the border with Central Asia. Christianity also came from the West. The only religion locally born is Taoism. Plus Confucianism, which is not, we don't consider as a religion here, but has played a mainstream role throughout Chinese history. Government officials were selected based on imperial exams on Confucian classics since the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. I had a chance to accompany in 2015 a delegation of the Italian section of Religions for Peace to visit religious venues of the 5 religions, official religions in China, and talk with religious leaders. The present government officials of the Communist Party today are pretty much like China's mandarins historically. The Confucian approach towards religion is to keep them in the private space and out of the political rhyme. From very early on, Mahayana Buddhist monks in China were confined to temples in the monasteries at the outskirts of the cities. Therefore, in a certain sense, there's a subordination of religions to temporal authority. The government is supposed to administer the country. Why in Europe, historically, spiritual authority is above temporal authority. Just think of Charlemagne, the Roman emperor, Holy Emperor, was crowned by the Pope, and even the coronation of Napoleon, to a certain extent, is implicit of that. While in China, the temporal authority is to administer the religions. With regard to skepticism towards Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant alike, since the 19th century, has been associated with Western imperialism in the minds of Chinese people. The Chinese government, because of this perception, is cautious that religion, particularly Catholicism, which is well organized at international level, may become a political tool for foreign interference, true or false, but similar issues in Tibet and Xinjiang are allegedly associated with terrorism and separatism. At least this is how the government perceived it. Catholicism and Protestantism are considered 2 separate religions. Did the Chinese government separate them on purpose for control? I mean, very often we see from the eyes of the government is doing this and that, for control, to separate them. But it might not be so, because historically, there are historical factors. Catholics and Protestant missionaries arrived in China in separate periods with 2 sets of terminologies. Calling God, for example, for the Catholics, Tianzu. That's why we call it Tianzu Jiao in China. Why for the Protestants, they use the term Shangdi. So they were perceived as 2 separate religions because of that. And the fact that even the Catholics are less than 1% of the population is considered an official religion in China because it has a historical role and have a presence in the history of China. Unlike, for example, the Orthodox Church, which with a small number is not considered an official religion recognized. The present With the open door policy of economic reform, actually there was a revival of religions after the Cultural Revolution. There have been flourishing of religions, especially remarkable increase of Buddhist and Protestant Christians. But there was growth in the 5 religions, except the Catholic Church. I have this big question then. At a certain point, how come there is no growth for the Catholic Church? Starting from the 90s, there were summer camps organized by Buddhist groups, Christian fellowship near university campuses. Many young people and students are attracted and join them. We may say that the Protestants are more active in bringing newcomers to their groups. Nevertheless, for Catholics, some dioceses also held summer camps for students and young people. And Catholic student associations were formed in many host countries where students study. Also, there are Protestant entrepreneurs, but also Catholics entrepreneurs as well, who have an impact on society and influence others. There might be different factors why Catholics are not growing in number. One major factor is that the Catholic Church became taboo, just fell victim of the complex situations. I remember talking to a scholar of the academic social science in Shanghai. He said, it's difficult for us to do research on the Catholic Church because it's considered sensitive. And the polarization between the officials and underground church, I think, because of politicizing and all that of the situation, it has become a main cause of Catholics not growing. But although, as of now, this polarization is diminishing, especially among the youth. Holy See and People's Republic of China have signed and renewed the provisional agreement regarding the appointment of bishops since 2018. It is a breakthrough. The effect will be seen more clearly in time. As Yan used this expression, civil religion concept, asked, is the state indeed supporting traditional values, or in folk religions, just to gain more support to create these common values, the China dream, core values of social values, just to gain support for their ideology? I find whatever the motivation, there's an opportunity. As engagement, I think engagement is important. And as a Chinese saying goes, there's always an opportunity in a crisis. 危机，危中有机. And I see this crisis with the in the Catholic Church can as well be an opportunity. In fact, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue of the Vatican is promoting a series of Christian Taoist colloquium aiming to dialogue with China. And China held the Beijing Expo in 2019 on horticulture. The Holy See participated with an official pavilion exhibiting for 6 months in Beijing. And the Religions for Peace in China is quite active in participating initiatives on ecological civilization and world peace. China's foreign minister expressed that in last September, expressed China's appreciation of Pope Francis' goodwill and friendliness in response to Pope saying that he is ready to go to China when Pope Francis and President Xi visited Kazakhstan almost at the same time 4 months ago. So, as a possible game changer, I see that from this crisis to opportunity, if a meeting between Pope Francis and President Xi will come true, if the Holy See-China relations would normalize eventually, it will certainly have an impact on the whole world. It will really be a game changer, contributing to world peace and bringing about more international friendship. So this is the end of my presentation. But as I was stimulated to think, since we are having this conference in Fordham, Jesuit University, could it be possible that when the Jesuits went to China, they, in bringing Christianity, Catholicism to China, at the same time, it's also a give and take. They also present to Europe with their lectures and with their translation of Chinese classics that somehow influence the period of enlightenment to philosophers like thinkers of that time in Europe, in France, like Voltaire and Rousseau. Actually, the concept of civil religion is coined by Rousseau, and as Ian mentioned, that the American sociologists also talk about civil religion and all this process of secularization of religions. And I think it's thought-provoking that we can make this comparison. Thank you.
Let's get to some questions and answers. Ian, why don't you stand here by the podium? I'll take the. I want to take this around. Just you sit here, stand by the podium, use that microphone. I'll stand here now if folks have questions. One quick question I had for the both of you. Chiaretto, can you hear me? Can you? If one question I had for you both is why is China even cynically using religion? I mean, the depiction of the sense of certainly Xi in these recent years is as a very autocratic person. Why don't they just stamp out religion? Is it something that they can't do, or is they just see there's a great opportunity there?
Sure, I may have a different view, but I mean, but my quick take would be that I think that the communist ideology is not enough of a frame for. It's not enough of a belief system for people to hold on to. That, you know, I showed that picture of that communist hero Lei Feng. I mean, kids all learn that in the high school, in their elementary school textbooks and high school textbooks, but most adults don't really believe in that, right? The fact that he's supposed to be a selfless guy and the Tibetan plateau working, whatever, and then there's a fantastic picture being taken of him. It's clearly a propaganda thing, and so I think it's hard for people to really believe and find those stories to be convincing. So I think that's why they feel a need to at least allow back in a little more of these other ideas, which are more tried and true over the centuries.
Civil religion is not enough.
Well, that they need to imbue the civil religion with these traditional ideas.
If you have questions, anybody, please. Let me come over and give you the microphone.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. I want to know, does the support of the government for the Buddhism or Taoism make them better or worse? I mean, because when I was maybe middle school or high school, I want to choose a religion. But I was born in China and in Zhejiang province, the religion is active in that place. But when I met the Christian people in Zhejiang, there are some rules that I cannot admit. Like it's not okay to be gay, or it's not okay to have sex before marriage. So I think it's ridiculous. So I want to go to the Buddhism community. I think it may be suitable for me, but I think they change their core value to just to support the government. It's not for the original core value. So I think their support from government may maybe made the Buddhism or Taoism worse. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, it's the same argument for the above ground churches in China. Some people feel that if you're going to a legal church, that it's also compromised by having government support in some way, and that's why some people feel that it's not okay. And specifically about Buddhism or Taoism, it is a double-edged sword, but the advantages are also not insignificant. There's this temple that I showed a picture of all that construction of the temple going up the hillside. The nunnery that I showed, they were all listening to Xi Jinping's speech, right? So that nunnery, now, by playing ball with the government, they get a lot of support. They get a lot of help. And they wanted to expand the temple. They got a geologist, a retired geologist was sent out to help them survey the ground, make sure they could construct up the hill, that it was safe. They also get kids to come over for culture classes from the local town. So they kind of like a summer camp where kids come by and learn calligraphy and maybe count, copy out the Tao Te Ching or something like that. And they don't necessarily believe it. Some of those kids may end up being very sympathetic or believe in Taoism. So it's a way to bring people into the temples. The temples become like local resources for communities, especially for spreading traditional Chinese culture or Chinese medicine in Taoist temples. So I think they view this as an opportunity. So I think you're right to some degree, but it's also a help for them.
Well, let me ask you a question. If you can hear me? We're speaking about young people in China, and of course there's a lot of news about the demographic decline in China. Who is religious in China? In the United States, older people tend to be religious. Are younger people being drawn to, and this is the same question to you, Ian, the Kyoreto, are young people coming to religions, whether they are traditional folk religions or Christianity?
More or less, I got your question about the young people. Well, young people are open, to new ideas, and there's a lot of, I think, more and more exchanges. There are many students going abroad to study in the U.S., in other countries, tourists and all that. No, I'm quite optimistic that these exchanges will bring about changes. The present situation in China, very often we emphasize also the foreign media on suppression of religions, control and all that. No, but I think young people are quite open, are very open to new ideas, and certainly more and more in the future, the situation in China will change, and we are in a critical time that the whole world scenario, is of tension. So I think if we look at things differently, if we have more exchanges And even in the Chinese government, there's a sense of crisis, facing many continuous challenges, and they try to adapt. So I think the fact that there's emphasis on values, common values, universal values, is an opportunity. So I'm optimistic on the future generation in China.
Ian?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. I would only add that I think there is a definite effort by different faith groups to reach out. And I think that the so-called traditional faiths, so say Buddhism and Taoism, have taken a page out of especially the Protestant church in China and tried more explicit outreach. One of the problems that the traditional religions, Buddhism and Taoism, have is that a lot of them are on the outskirts of town, and so they will have, it's sort of a place that people go to just occasionally for a temple fair or something like that. Some of them now use more active methods where they have, like Buddhist temples will have sutra study groups on Wednesday nights or something like that in the city, just really copying almost Bible study. And they try to have more outreach to younger people by having, I don't know, one temple had some computer robot that spoke to people and stuff like that. I don't know who that was.
It's a mega church in the United States.
Yeah. But I think there is an effort for sure. I do see in a lot of these places younger people. Again, without real survey work, it's hard to give a definitive answer.
Yes.
Thanks, Ian. I'm curious about the effect of China's zero COVID policy on religions, because the government's, as you mentioned, been willing to rely on sort of like procedural violations to restrict religious practice. I'm wondering how the pandemic has affected different groups' ability to practice.
Yeah, I think it's been a big problem for some of the groups for sure. I haven't been in China in a couple of years because of the zero COVID policy and various other reasons. But from what my friends say, for example, these temple fairs, they were all canceled, right? They were the first in 2020, they were canceled. In 2021, they sort of came back in 2022, but it was really dependent on the local situation. The instinct, the reflex was to close it and to not allow these things to happen. I think now the zero COVID's been relaxed. It will sort of be a free for all in 2023, and we'll probably see a lot more events.
Yeah, well, as for the COVID, I think you can see this drastic change of policy. Now it's normal life. I live in Shanghai, but just now I'm in Wenzhou. And then I travel visiting some friends, some Catholic groups, and I went to a pilgrimage. I saw different groups and group of young people visiting this pilgrimage site in Fujian. It's quite interesting that we talk of control and all that, but there are many things going on that are unnoticed. That I think things will be normalized.
Questions?
First, thank you for the presentation. It was really inspiring. My conjoined question would be, can this openness to religious policies be seen as the future evolution of Marxism? Because this can also be seen in other Marxist-leaning countries, for example, Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. And if so, could that mean a perhaps future downplay in international Marxism that can lead to the adoption of capitalist and pro-democratic policies within these countries?
It could lead to what?
To the adoption of pro-capitalist and democratic policies within these countries.
Well, capitalists, sure, I think that's possible in China. I think the government has lots of trouble with that, but democracy, if you mean one person, one vote, etc. That is not the government's intention at all. And I think it would, that, if it ever happens in China, it will be a long way off in the future. And I don't know if I could see religion undermining one-party rule anywhere in the near future, to be honest.
I thought your observation about the comparison to Putin's Russia, especially in the wake of, it's similar co-opting. I mean, Russian Orthodoxy is much more central to Russian identity, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's probably why. And I think also the reason Putin adopted it was also that the Russian state is in such a precarious position and remains in a more precarious position. I mean, China still, despite the economic problems and maybe longer term economic problems, has a much more functioning economy. It doesn't have to, they don't need to resort to such dramatic, say, measures as, say, completely adopting a religion or something like that in order to keep in power. For the government, it can be seen as something that will buttress their ideology rather than replacing it.
Let me pose one final question. We're about out of time. Just a moment.
Hi, Ian. Thank you for being with us today. And what I really wanted to ask you is, a handful of Western countries, particularly the United States, have accused the Chinese government of human rights violations against Uyghur Muslims, specifically by putting them in detention camps or education camps, beating them, and just the list goes on. And earlier in the presentation, you talk about how these groups, such as the Uyghur Muslims or Muslims in general, are seen as extremists. And I want to ask you, why does the Chinese government have such a problem with people like Uyghur Muslims? And how does their presence affect the possibility of religions such as Islam being able to coexist with authoritarian governments like China's?
Well, I think there's, ultimately, you could look at it in different ways. I think, for one thing, there is a problem with extremism in some parts of the Muslim communities in China. So I think, like with all things, there's a kernel element of the truth in what the government's claiming, but it's just exaggerated. So the government makes it seem as if any Muslim with a long beard and whatever, who's fasting on and doing various things during Ramadan, that they're extremists. And so I think this is basically a form of Han chauvinism. It's an effort to impose Chinese culture on the minorities. There are 55 minorities in China. There's 56 ethnic groups in China. Han Chinese make up 91% of the population. The other 9% of the population, roughly 100 million people, are made up of these 55 other ethnic groups. And so, because also in China, Islam and ethnicity are bound up. There are 10 ethnic Muslim groups in China. So it's sort of technically impossible for a Han Chinese person to be Muslim. You are ipso facto Uyghur or Hui or one of the others. So this is a thing that's a complicated situation in China. But I think these areas were conquered relatively late in Chinese history, only the past couple of 100 years. And I think that there's been this sort of steady effort to send settlers out there, to send more Chinese out there, and to make it part of the Chinese cultural melting pot, rather than allowing true autonomy in these regions. I think that's sort of the underlying idea, the implicit idea in these policies.
Yeah, and I just want to ask one final question, both of you. I think I need to speak into this. Mike Chiaretto, you spoke about and from the outside, you see the underground church, you said, and the above ground church, or the patriotic church, the legal church. We see those as two very separate, divided things, an underground church and an above ground church. What is the relationship between them on the ground? Is it as divided as we see?
As I mentioned in my response, that young people don't have this burden of the past, and this polarization between the official and the underground church actually for me, causes give the reason why Catholics are not growing. And I don't agree with Ian saying that the bishop was forced to resign in the process of this after the Vatican-China agreement. Actually, it was an ongoing process, this reconciliation. Only at a certain point, the bishop quit himself, I mean, in this process. And I think if we continue to work on this reconciliation process with the Holy See, then even it presents as a possibility, a chance for the Catholic Church to grow more. So I would say that we are very much linked to the past, cultural revolution, and if going back to history, actually China has been open, to as I said, these religions coming from abroad, and they are recognized as official religions in China. So with the prevalence of now even Chinese Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhism, a certain integration, interculturality between foreign religions and Chinese culture. And if we look at the situation with this light, I think there can be opportunities and more contributions for really for the whole world.
Ian, do you have a quick thought on that, the underground?
Yeah, no, I agree with, I mean, my choice of words forced to resign is not accurate. It's more like he was asked to resign or given a letter from. It was part of the reconciliation effort, and I think that, you can say he was loyal and he resigned because the official bishop the government appointed bishop was supposed to take over that area. Yeah, no, I think that it's also quite geographically dependent. There's some areas where the above ground church is dominant and the underground church is minuscule, like in Shanxi province, and then there's other places where the underground church is dominant and the above ground church is small. And that's dependent on history and a variety of things. So it's not like they're always clashing. And I do think we have to wait and see how this plays out. If there can be more bishops approved under this new arrangement, then that could really help the church in China. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Ian Johnson here in Manhattan. Thank you, Fioretto Yan from Shanghai.